The morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound as Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez adjusted her civilian clothes one final time. She had deliberately chosen a simple blue dress and modest heels, wanting to observe the base operations without the immediate deference that came with her uniform. Today marked her first unofficial visit to Fort Harrison before officially taking command next week. Sarah had earned this position through 20 years of dedicated service, multiple combat deployments, and exceptional leadership skills that had caught the attention of Pentagon officials. At 38, she was young for such a prestigious command, but her record spoke volumes. She had successfully led peacekeeping missions in 3 different countries, transformed underperforming units into elite forces, and earned the respect of soldiers and officers alike throughout her career. The main gate of Fort Harrison stood imposing against the morning sky, its concrete barriers and security checkpoints designed to keep unauthorized personnel out. Sarah approached with confidence, her identification ready and her mind focused on the day ahead. She wanted to see how the base operated when the commanding officer wasn't expected, to get an honest picture of the unit she would soon lead. Sergeant First Class Mike Thompson stood at attention behind the security desk, his uniform crisp and his manner professional. He had been stationed at Fort Harrison for 6 years and took pride in maintaining the highest security standards. When he saw the young woman in civilian clothes approaching, he automatically shifted into his standard protocol mode. "Good morning, ma'am. Purpose of your visit today?" Thompson asked, his tone polite but firm. He had processed thousands of visitors over the years, from family members to contractors to government officials, and he could usually categorize people quickly. "I'm here to observe base operations," Sarah replied, handing over her military identification card. "I have authorization from the Pentagon for an inspection visit." Thompson took the ID and scanned it through his computer system. The name Sarah Martinez appeared on his screen along with her rank and clearance level, but something seemed off to him. This young woman in civilian clothes didn't look like any lieutenant colonel he had ever seen. Most of the female officers he knew were older, more formal in their presentation, and certainly didn't show up for official business dressed like they were going to a business meeting in town. "Ma'am, I'm going to need additional verification," Thompson said, his voice taking on a slightly skeptical tone. "This identification shows a very high rank, and protocol requires me to confirm all visits from field-grade officers." Sarah nodded patiently. She understood security procedures and actually appreciated that the guards were taking their duties seriously. "Of course, Sergeant. What additional verification do you need?" "I'll need to contact your unit to confirm your identity and the purpose of your visit," Thompson explained, reaching for his telephone. "Standard procedure for all unannounced visits from senior personnel." What Thompson didn't realize was that Sarah's appointment as the new commanding officer was still classified information. Only a handful of senior officers knew about the change, and the official announcement wouldn't come until the change of command ceremony scheduled for the following week. His attempts to verify her visit would lead to confusion rather than confirmation. Corporal Jessica Hayes stood nearby, processing vehicles and monitoring the conversation between Thompson and the woman in civilian clothes. She had been at Fort Harrison for 2 years and had developed a keen sense for spotting people who didn't belong. Something about this situation triggered her instincts. "Sarge," Hayes whispered to Thompson, "that lady doesn't look military to me. I've seen plenty of female officers, and they don't usually show up looking like they're going to a job interview." Thompson nodded slightly, sharing his subordinate's suspicions. In his experience, senior officers visiting for official business arrived in uniform, with advance notice, and usually with an entourage. This lone woman in civilian attire claiming to be a lieutenant colonel didn't fit the pattern. "Ma'am, I'm having difficulty verifying your credentials," Thompson said after several unsuccessful phone calls. "The units I'm contacting don't have any record of an authorized inspection visit today." Sarah remained calm, though she could see where this was heading. "Sergeant, could you contact Colonel Williams in personnel? He should be able to verify my authorization." "Ma'am, Colonel Williams is currently deployed overseas," Thompson replied. "His replacement is Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, and he's indicated he has no knowledge of your visit." The situation was becoming increasingly tense. A small crowd of soldiers had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of guards questioning someone claiming high rank. Sarah realized that her attempt to observe the base quietly was turning into a spectacle, but she also recognized this as a valuable lesson about the unit's security consciousness. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez approached from the vehicle checkpoint, having overheard parts of the conversation. She had 12 years of military experience and prided herself on her ability to spot irregularities. "What's the situation here, Thompson?" "This civilian claims to be a lieutenant colonel, but we can't verify her credentials or her purpose for being here," Thompson explained. "She's asking for access to observe base operations, but we have no record of authorized visits today." Rodriguez studied Sarah carefully, noting her composed demeanor and professional bearing. Still, something felt wrong about the entire situation. "Ma'am, I understand you believe you have authorization to be here, but our procedures are very clear. Without proper verification, we cannot grant access to the base." Sarah appreciated the professionalism of the guards, even as their suspicions grew. "I understand your position, Sergeant Rodriguez. Could I speak with the duty officer?" "The duty officer is Captain Morrison, and he's currently in a briefing that cannot be interrupted," Rodriguez replied. "However, I can arrange for you to wait in the visitors' area while we continue trying to verify your credentials." The visitors' area was a small, sterile room with uncomfortable chairs and security cameras monitoring every corner. Sarah found herself escorted there by 2 guards, treated more like a potential security threat than a senior officer. The irony wasn't lost on her. In less than a week, these same guards would be saluting her as their commanding officer. As she waited, Sarah could hear conversations in the hallway outside. The guards were discussing her case with growing skepticism, questioning everything from her appearance to her story. She realized this situation was providing her with invaluable insight into the base's security culture and the professionalism of her future subordinates. Captain James Morrison finally arrived 2 hours later, his expression serious and his manner formal. He had been briefed on the situation and approached it with the caution of an officer responsible for base security. "Ma'am, I understand you're claiming to be Lieutenant Colonel Martinez." "I am Lieutenant Colonel Martinez," Sarah replied firmly. "I have valid identification and authorization from the Pentagon." Morrison studied her carefully. He had reviewed her file on the computer system, noting her impressive record and upcoming assignment to Fort Harrison. However, the photograph in the system was several years old, taken when she was a major, and showed her in military uniform with a more formal appearance. "Ma'am, while your identification appears authentic, we have several concerns," Morrison explained. "First, we have no record of any authorized inspection visit. Second, your appearance doesn't match our expectation for a senior officer conducting official business. Third, the Pentagon office we contacted has no immediate knowledge of your current assignment." Sarah realized that the classification of her new position was creating exactly this type of confusion. "Captain Morrison, I understand your dilemma. My appointment to this command is classified until the official announcement. I came here today in civilian clothes because I wanted to observe normal operations without the disruption that comes with a formal visit." "Ma'am, that story raises even more red flags," Morrison replied. "If your appointment is classified, how do you expect us to verify it? And if you're truly a lieutenant colonel, why wouldn't you follow proper channels for an official visit?" The conversation continued in circles, with Morrison becoming increasingly convinced that Sarah was either lying about her identity or had some ulterior motive for wanting access to the base. He had dealt with journalists trying to gain unauthorized access, family members of soldiers making false claims, and even foreign agents attempting to infiltrate military installations. Meanwhile, word of the situation had spread throughout the base. Soldiers gathered in small groups, discussing the strange case of the woman claiming to be their new commanding officer. Most were skeptical, having never seen a senior officer dress so casually or arrive without proper advance notice. Master Sergeant Robert Chen, the senior enlisted man on duty, approached Morrison with additional concerns. "Sir, I've been asking around, and nobody has heard anything about getting a new commanding officer. Colonel Bradley is supposed to be in command for another 6 months before his retirement." This information only deepened Morrison's suspicions. If Sarah was truly the incoming commanding officer, surely the senior enlisted personnel would have been informed. The military rarely kept such significant changes completely secret from the non-commissioned officers who actually ran day-to-day operations. "Ma'am," Morrison said, returning to the visitors area, "I'm afraid we have a serious problem. Not only can we not verify your claimed identity, but our senior personnel have no knowledge of any command changes. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the base." Sarah felt a mixture of frustration and admiration. These soldiers were doing their jobs exactly as they should, protecting their base from unauthorized access and refusing to be intimidated by claims of rank or authority. Even though their suspicions were misplaced, their dedication to security was exactly what she wanted to see in her future command. "Captain Morrison, I respect your position and the thoroughness of your security procedures," Sarah said. "However, I am who I claim to be, and I do have legitimate business here. Is there any superior officer you can contact who might be able to resolve this situation?" Morrison considered the request. The base commander, Colonel Bradley, was attending a conference at the Pentagon and wouldn't return until evening. The executive officer was on leave, and most of the senior staff were involved in training exercises off base. The timing of Sarah's visit couldn't have been worse for verification purposes. "Ma'am, I can try to contact Colonel Bradley's office at the Pentagon, but given the time difference and his conference schedule, we might not reach him until late today," Morrison explained. "In the meantime, I'm afraid I cannot allow you access to the base." The standoff continued as afternoon approached. Sarah remained patient and professional, understanding that these soldiers were simply doing their duty. She had encountered similar situations during her career and knew that pressing too hard would only increase their suspicions. As the hours passed, more personnel became involved in trying to resolve the situation. Phone calls were made to various Pentagon offices, military personnel databases were searched, and background checks were conducted. Each inquiry seemed to raise more questions than answers, particularly given the classified nature of Sarah's appointment. The guards began to develop theories about who this mysterious woman might really be. Some suggested she was a journalist trying to gain access for a story. Others wondered if she might be a family member of a soldier, using false identification to circumvent visitor restrictions. A few even speculated that she could be a foreign agent testing their security procedures. Sarah observed all of this with professional interest. She was seeing her future command from an entirely different perspective, learning about their security consciousness, their communication systems, and their decision-making processes under unusual circumstances. While the situation was frustrating personally, it was providing invaluable insight into the unit she would soon lead. As the day wore on, the determination of the guards never wavered. They continued to treat Sarah with professional courtesy while maintaining their position that she could not be granted access without proper verification. Their commitment to security protocols, even in the face of claimed authority, impressed her greatly. The sun began to set over Fort Harrison, casting long shadows across the compound once again. Sarah had spent nearly 8 hours in the visitors' area, watching through the windows as soldiers went about their daily duties. Tomorrow, she would return with proper advance notice and in full uniform, ready to begin the process of officially taking command. But today had taught her something valuable about the men and women she would soon lead. They were professionals who took their duties seriously, who couldn't be intimidated or impressed by claims of rank without proper verification, and who worked together effectively to maintain security. These were exactly the qualities she wanted in soldiers under her command. As Captain Morrison prepared to escort her off the base for the final time that day, Sarah smiled slightly. These guards had no idea they were about to get the surprise of their careers. In just 5 days, the woman they had refused entry would be standing before them as their commanding officer, and she would remember every detail of how they had handled this challenging situation. The weekend passed slowly for Sarah Martinez as she reviewed files and prepared for her official introduction to Fort Harrison. She had spent Friday evening in her hotel room, writing detailed notes about everything she had observed during her unsuccessful attempt to enter the base. The professionalism of the guards, their unwavering commitment to security protocols, and their ability to work as a team under pressure had all impressed her greatly. Monday morning arrived with typical military precision. Sarah stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting her dress uniform one final time. Every ribbon was perfectly aligned, every crease razor-sharp, every detail meeting the exacting standards expected of a senior officer. Today, she would return to Fort Harrison not as a mysterious civilian, but as Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, the new commanding officer. The Pentagon had finally resolved the classification issues over the weekend. Her appointment was now official and documented in all the appropriate databases. Colonel Bradley had been contacted and briefed on Friday's events, and he had assured headquarters that the situation would be resolved immediately upon her arrival. At Fort Harrison, the guards began their Monday shift with the usual briefing. Sergeant First Class Thompson reviewed the weekend's incidents and prepared his team for another day of protecting the base. The strange case of the woman claiming to be a lieutenant colonel had become something of a legend among the security personnel, discussed and analyzed throughout the weekend. "I still think there was something fishy about that whole situation," Corporal Hayes said as she checked her equipment. "Nobody just shows up claiming to be a senior officer without proper advance notice." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "The whole thing felt wrong from the beginning. I mean, what kind of lieutenant colonel wears civilian clothes to conduct an official inspection? It doesn't make sense." Thompson had spent the weekend thinking about Friday's events. While he remained convinced that denying access had been the correct decision, something about the woman's calm professionalism had stuck with him. She never became angry, never tried to intimidate them, and never acted like someone who was lying about their identity. "Whatever the real story was, we followed procedure," Thompson said firmly. "That's what matters. We protected the base and we did our jobs correctly." Captain Morrison arrived at the gate complex for his morning rounds, reviewing the weekend reports and preparing for the day ahead. Colonel Bradley had called him personally on Sunday evening to discuss Friday's incident, and Morrison was expecting some kind of resolution today. At exactly 800 hours, a black sedan with Pentagon license plates approached the main gate. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, wearing her full dress uniform with all decorations and insignia clearly visible. The driver was a senior enlisted man from headquarters who had been assigned to escort her to Fort Harrison for her official introduction. Thompson saw the approaching vehicle and automatically shifted into his formal inspection mode. Pentagon vehicles always meant important visitors, and he wanted everything perfect. As the sedan stopped at the checkpoint, he approached with crisp military bearing. "Good morning. Purpose of your visit?" Thompson asked, then stopped suddenly as he recognized the woman in the passenger seat. His eyes widened as he took in the uniform, the rank insignia, and the impressive array of ribbons and decorations across her chest. Sarah looked directly at Thompson, her expression calm and professional. "Good morning, Sergeant Thompson. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez reporting for duty as the new commanding officer of Fort Harrison." The silence that followed was deafening. Thompson stared at the uniform, the identification card, and then back at Sarah's face, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was the same woman he had denied access to just 3 days ago, the woman he had suspected of lying about her identity. Corporal Hayes approached the vehicle and immediately froze when she recognized Sarah. The woman they had turned away on Friday was sitting before them in a perfectly pressed uniform with lieutenant colonel rank insignia, looking every inch the senior officer she had claimed to be. "Sergeant Thompson, I believe we've met before," Sarah said with a slight smile. "I attempted to visit your base on Friday for an unofficial observation. You may recall the conversation." Thompson's face turned several shades of red as the full implications of the situation hit him. He had spent hours questioning the credentials of his new commanding officer, had treated her like a potential security threat, and had ultimately escorted her off the base. His career flashed before his eyes as he imagined the consequences of his actions. "Ma'am, the identification couldn't be verified," Thompson stammered, his usual composure completely shattered. "We followed standard protocol for unverified visitors." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez hurried over when she noticed the commotion, then stopped dead in her tracks when she saw Sarah. The woman in the simple blue dress from Friday was now clearly identifiable as a lieutenant colonel, and Rodriguez realized with growing horror that they had refused entry to their new commanding officer. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we didn't know. Your appointment wasn't in our system and we couldn't verify." Sarah raised her hand to stop the explanations. "Sergeant Rodriguez, Sergeant Thompson, Corporal Hayes, you all did exactly what you should have done. You followed proper security procedures, you refused to be intimidated by claims of authority, and you protected this base according to your training." The guards exchanged confused glances. They had expected anger, disciplinary action, or at minimum a severe reprimand. Instead, their new commanding officer was praising their actions. Captain Morrison approached the checkpoint after being notified of the arriving Pentagon vehicle. When he saw Sarah in uniform, his stomach dropped to his shoes. He had been the one to make the final decision to deny her access, and he had personally escorted her off the base. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez," Morrison said, attempting to maintain his composure despite his growing panic. "Ma'am, I want to offer my sincere apologies for Friday's incident, if we had been properly notified." "Captain Morrison," Sarah interrupted, "you made the correct decision based on the information available to you. I deliberately chose not to announce my visit in advance because I wanted to observe normal operations. What I discovered was a security team that cannot be compromised by claims of authority or intimidated by rank." Morrison wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "Ma'am, you're not upset about being turned away." Sarah stepped out of the sedan, her bearing commanding immediate attention from everyone present. "On the contrary, Captain, I'm extremely impressed by the performance of your security team. They demonstrated exactly the kind of professional skepticism and attention to detail that keeps military installations secure." The guards listened in amazement as their new commanding officer continued to praise their actions from Friday. They had spent the weekend worrying about potential consequences, imagining disciplinary actions and negative performance reviews, only to discover that their new leader approved of their decisions. "However," Sarah continued, "this incident has revealed some communication issues that we need to address. The fact that my appointment wasn't properly coordinated with base security suggests problems in our information flow." Thompson found his voice again. "Ma'am, we tried multiple verification channels, but your appointment seemed to be classified." "It was classified, Sergeant, and that created exactly the situation we experienced on Friday," Sarah explained. "In the future, we'll ensure that security personnel receive appropriate notifications about command changes, even when other details remain classified." The small crowd of guards and soldiers began to relax as they realized they weren't in trouble. Instead of facing disciplinary action, they were receiving praise from their new commanding officer for following proper procedures. "I want each of you to understand something important," Sarah said, addressing the assembled personnel. "Military security depends on soldiers who do their duty regardless of pressure, intimidation, or claims of special authority. You demonstrated that commitment on Friday." Corporal Hayes stepped forward hesitantly. "Ma'am, may I ask why you came in civilian clothes?" Sarah smiled at the question. "Excellent question, Corporal. I wanted to see how the base operates when the commanding officer isn't expected. I wanted to observe normal procedures, not the special arrangements that usually accompany official visits." "And what did you observe, ma'am?" Thompson asked, his curiosity overcoming his nervousness. "I observed soldiers who take their responsibilities seriously," Sarah replied. "I saw guards who couldn't be bluffed or intimidated. I watched professionals who worked together to solve a difficult problem. Most importantly, I learned that Fort Harrison has exactly the kind of security-conscious personnel I want protecting this installation." The tension that had gripped the security team began to dissolve as they realized their new commanding officer valued their professionalism rather than being offended by their skepticism. This was a completely different response than they had expected. Captain Morrison seized the opportunity to ask a question that had been bothering him all weekend. "Ma'am, when you couldn't gain access on Friday, why didn't you contact Colonel Bradley directly to resolve the situation?" "Because that would have defeated the entire purpose of the visit," Sarah explained. "If I had used command authority to override your security procedures, I would have learned nothing about how the base really operates. More importantly, I would have sent the wrong message about the value of security protocols." Master Sergeant Chen approached the group, having been summoned by the unusual gathering at the main gate. When he saw Sarah in uniform, he immediately recognized her from the photos that had finally been distributed over the weekend. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez," Chen said, saluting crisply. "Master Sergeant Chen, Senior Enlisted Advisor. Ma'am, I understand there was some confusion on Friday regarding your visit." Sarah returned the salute. Master Sergeant, there was no confusion. Your security team performed exactly as they should have when faced with an unverified visitor making extraordinary claims. Chen had been briefed on the entire situation and had expected to find his guards in serious trouble. Instead, he was witnessing his new commanding officer praising their actions and using the incident as a teaching moment. "Ma'am," Chen said, "I've reviewed Friday's reports, and I want you to know that these soldiers followed every procedure correctly. They demonstrated the kind of security consciousness that keeps our people safe." "I completely agree, Master Sergeant," Sarah replied. "In fact, I plan to use Friday's incident as a case study for other installations. Your team showed how proper security procedures should work, even under pressure." The guards looked at each other with growing amazement. Not only were they not in trouble, but their actions were being held up as an example for other bases. The woman they had turned away was now their commanding officer, and she was prouder of their work than they had dared to hope. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found the courage to voice what everyone was thinking. "Ma'am, we were convinced you weren't really a lieutenant colonel. You just didn't fit our expectations." Sarah laughed the first time any of them had seen her display humor. "Sergeant Rodriguez, that's exactly why the test was valuable. Real threats don't usually announce themselves or fit our expectations. Foreign agents don't wear uniforms with name tags. Security breaches happen when we stop questioning things that seem slightly wrong." Thompson nodded slowly as he understood the larger lesson. "Ma'am, you're saying that our suspicions were actually appropriate." "Your suspicions were not only appropriate, they were essential," Sarah confirmed. "Military security fails when soldiers stop asking questions, stop verifying credentials, and start making assumptions based on appearance or claimed authority." The morning sun was climbing higher, and other personnel throughout the base were beginning to take notice of the gathering at the main gate. Word was spreading that the new commanding officer had arrived, and that somehow the woman from Friday's incident was the same person. Captain Morrison realized he needed to ask a practical question. "Ma'am, how would you like to proceed with your official introduction to the base?" Sarah considered the question. "Captain, I think Friday's incident has already introduced me to the most important aspects of this command. I've learned that Fort Harrison has dedicated professionals who take their duties seriously. Now I need to see how the rest of the base operates." As they prepared to move beyond the gate complex, Sarah turned back to address the guards one final time. "Sergeant Thompson, Sergeant Rodriguez, Corporal Hayes, I want you to remember Friday as a success story, not a mistake. You protected this base exactly as you were trained to do." The guards stood at attention as Sarah prepared to enter Fort Harrison officially for the first time. They had begun the day expecting consequences for their Friday actions, only to discover that their new commanding officer considered their performance exemplary. As the Pentagon sedan moved through the main gate, Sarah reflected on the unexpected beginning to her command. She had come to Fort Harrison hoping to observe normal operations quietly. Instead, she had learned something far more valuable about the character and professionalism of the soldiers she would now lead. The Pentagon sedan rolled through Fort Harrison's main thoroughfare as Sarah got her first official look at the base she would command. Buildings lined both sides of the road, from administrative offices to barracks, maintenance facilities to training centers. Soldiers went about their morning duties, some stopping to salute the passing vehicle when they noticed the senior officer inside. Colonel William Bradley stood waiting on the steps of the headquarters building, his uniform immaculate and his bearing reflecting 30 years of military service. He had commanded Fort Harrison for 18 months and was looking forward to retirement, but Friday's incident had reminded him why he loved working with professional soldiers. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez," Bradley said, saluting as Sarah exited the vehicle. "Welcome to Fort Harrison. I understand you've already had an interesting introduction to our security procedures." Sarah returned the salute crisply. "Colonel Bradley, thank you for the warm welcome, and yes, Friday was quite educational." Bradley had spent the weekend reviewing every detail of Friday's incident, from the initial contact at the gate through Sarah's eventual escort off the base. He had been prepared to discipline his security team until he learned the full circumstances surrounding Sarah's visit. "Ma'am, I want to personally apologize for the confusion on Friday," Bradley said as they walked toward his office. "If my people had been properly notified of your appointment." Colonel, please don't apologize for having security-conscious soldiers, Sarah interrupted. Friday's incident showed me that Fort Harrison has exactly the kind of personnel I hope to find here. Bradley's office overlooked the main parade ground, where soldiers were conducting morning physical training. The walls displayed awards and photographs from his long career, including deployments to 3 different combat zones and command positions at bases around the world. "Ma'am, I've had a chance to review your file since Friday," Bradley said as they settled into chairs around his conference table. "Your record is impressive: multiple combat deployments, outstanding performance ratings, and exceptional leadership experience. Fort Harrison is fortunate to have you." Sarah appreciated the colonel's gracious welcome, particularly given the unusual circumstances of her arrival. "Thank you, Colonel. I'm looking forward to learning more about the base and meeting the soldiers I'll be working with." "About Friday's incident," Bradley continued, "I want you to know that I've reviewed every detail of how my people handled the situation. They followed proper procedures throughout, even when faced with pressure to make exceptions." "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear," Sarah replied. "Security procedures are only effective when soldiers follow them consistently, regardless of circumstances." Bradley opened a folder containing reports from Friday's incident. "According to Captain Morrison's documentation, you remained professional and patient throughout the entire process. That speaks well of your leadership style." "Colonel, I was observing soldiers doing their duty under difficult circumstances. Getting angry or demanding special treatment would have defeated the purpose of the visit." As they discussed Friday's events, word was spreading throughout Fort Harrison that the new commanding officer had arrived. Soldiers gathered in small groups, discussing the strange story of the woman who had been turned away at the gate only to return as their new leader. In the security office, Sergeant Thompson was fielding questions from curious personnel who had heard about Friday's incident. The story had grown in the telling over the weekend, with some versions claiming the woman had demanded access while others suggested she had tried to sneak onto the base. "All I can tell you is that we followed proper procedures," Thompson explained to a group of junior soldiers. "We couldn't verify her credentials, so we denied access. That's what we're supposed to do." Corporal Hayes was dealing with similar questions from her peers. Many soldiers found it hard to believe that someone claiming to be a lieutenant colonel would show up in civilian clothes without proper advance notice. "I'm telling you, something felt wrong about the whole situation," Hayes explained. "She might really be a lieutenant colonel, but on Friday she looked like someone trying to get onto the base under false pretenses." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was having a different conversation with her team. As a senior non-commissioned officer, she was focused on the lessons learned from Friday's incident rather than the gossip surrounding it. "The important thing is that we did our jobs correctly," Rodriguez told her soldiers. "When you can't verify someone's credentials, you deny access. It doesn't matter what rank they claim or how professional they seem." Captain Morrison was preparing a detailed briefing for Colonel Bradley about the base's security procedures and how they had been applied on Friday. He wanted to ensure that his commander understood every decision that had been made. Meanwhile, Sarah was receiving her first formal briefing about Fort Harrison's mission and capabilities. The base housed 3 battalion-sized units with different specializations, from logistics support to communications to transportation. Over 4,000 military and civilian personnel worked on the installation. "Our primary mission is supporting deployment operations for units heading to overseas assignments," Bradley explained. "We provide training, equipment preparation, and logistical coordination for forces throughout the eastern United States." Sarah studied the organizational charts and mission statements with professional interest. Fort Harrison was larger and more complex than some of her previous commands, with responsibilities that extended far beyond the base itself. "What about the security situation?" Sarah asked. "Friday's incident aside, how do you assess the overall security posture?" Bradley smiled at the question. "Ma'am, Friday's incident actually demonstrated that our security posture is excellent. My people couldn't be intimidated, compromised, or convinced to make exceptions to established procedures." "That's a valuable assessment, Colonel. Too many installations have security problems because soldiers are afraid to challenge authority figures." As the morning progressed, Sarah met with various department heads and senior officers. Each briefing provided more insight into the base's operations, but she found herself particularly interested in learning more about the security team that had handled Friday's incident so professionally. "I'd like to spend some time with your security personnel," Sarah told Bradley. "Not to address Friday's situation, but to better understand their procedures and training." "Of course, ma'am. Captain Morrison runs an excellent security operation. His people are well-trained and highly motivated." They walked to the security headquarters, a modern building near the main gate complex. Inside, Sarah could see duty rosters, security procedures, and monitoring equipment that provided comprehensive coverage of the base's perimeter. Captain Morrison was waiting when they arrived, having been notified of their visit. He had spent the morning reviewing every security protocol to ensure he could answer any questions about Friday's incident. "Captain Morrison," Sarah said, "I'd like to understand more about how your security procedures work, particularly in situations like we experienced on Friday." Morrison led them to a briefing room where large maps showed the base layout and security zones. "Ma'am, our procedures are designed to handle various threats, from unauthorized personnel to potential terrorist activities. Friday's incident involved our protocols for verifying credentials." "Walk me through exactly what happened," Sarah requested. Morrison consulted his notes and began a detailed timeline of Friday's events. "At approximately 9:30 hours, you approached the main gate and presented identification claiming to be Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez. Sergeant Thompson initiated standard verification procedures." "What made your people suspicious?" Sarah asked. "Several factors, ma'am," Morrison replied. "Your civilian attire was unusual for a senior officer conducting official business. Your visit wasn't on any authorized schedule. Most importantly, we couldn't verify your credentials through normal channels." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Those were all legitimate concerns. How did your people handle the verification attempts?" "We contacted multiple offices trying to confirm your identity and purpose," Morrison explained. "The classification of your appointment created problems because the offices we reached had no knowledge of your assignment to Fort Harrison. And when verification failed, we followed established procedures for denying access to unverified personnel," Morrison said. "You were treated professionally, but firmly informed that entry could not be granted." Sarah was impressed by the thoroughness of Morrison's documentation and the clear thinking that had guided his team's decisions. "Captain, how often do you deal with people claiming authority they don't possess?" "More often than you might think, ma'am," Morrison replied. "We've had journalists claiming to be officers, family members exaggerating their connections, and even foreign nationals attempting to gain unauthorized access." The conversation continued as Sarah learned more about the security challenges facing Fort Harrison. The base's mission meant constant movement of personnel and equipment, creating multiple opportunities for security breaches if procedures weren't followed carefully. "What training do your guards receive for situations like Friday's incident?" Sarah asked. "Extensive training in credential verification, threat assessment, and professional communication," Morrison answered. "We emphasize that authority must be verified, not assumed based on appearance or claims." Bradley interjected with his own observation. "Ma'am, Captain Morrison's training programs have created one of the most security-conscious teams I've worked with. Friday's incident proved that his methods work." Sarah was beginning to understand why Friday's incident had unfolded as it did. The security team had been trained to question authority, verify credentials, and protect the base against all threats. Her unannounced visit in civilian clothes had triggered exactly the response their training was designed to produce. "I'd like to meet with some of the guards who were involved on Friday," Sarah said. "Not for disciplinary purposes, but to better understand their perspective on the incident." Morrison arranged for Thompson, Rodriguez, and Hayes to join them in the briefing room. The three guards entered nervously, still uncertain about how their new commanding officer viewed Friday's events. "Sergeant Thompson," Sarah began, "walk me through your decision-making process on Friday. What were you thinking when I first approached your checkpoint?" Thompson took a deep breath before responding. "Ma'am, you presented identification showing high rank, but several things seemed inconsistent. Your civilian clothes, the lack of advance notice, and our inability to verify your credentials through normal channels." "What was your biggest concern?" That someone was attempting to gain unauthorized access by claiming false authority, Thompson replied honestly. We've been trained to be skeptical of such claims. Sarah turned to Corporal Hayes. Corporal, what was your assessment of the situation? Ma'am, something felt wrong from the beginning, Hayes said. Senior officers usually arrive in uniform with proper documentation and advance coordination. Your visit didn't fit that pattern. And Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, what guided your decisions? Ma'am, our primary responsibility is protecting this base, Rodriguez answered. When we couldn't verify your credentials, denying access was the only appropriate response. Sarah looked at each of the guards in turn. I want you to understand something important. Everything you did on Friday was correct. You followed proper procedures, you couldn't be intimidated by claims of authority, and you protected this installation exactly as you were trained to do. The visible relief on their faces was immediate. They had spent the weekend worrying about potential consequences, only to learn that their new commanding officer approved of their actions. Ma'am, Thompson said hesitantly, may I ask why you chose to visit in civilian clothes? Excellent question, Sergeant. I wanted to see how the base operates when the commanding officer isn't expected. Official visits often show me what people think I want to see, not how things really work. Hayes found the courage to ask her own question. Ma'am, what did you learn about Fort Harrison from Friday's incident? Sarah smiled at the question. I learned that this base has security-conscious professionals who take their duties seriously. I learned that my soldiers can't be bluffed or intimidated. Most importantly, I learned that Fort Harrison has exactly the kind of personnel I want protecting our people and our mission. As the briefing concluded, Sarah reflected on the unexpected education she had received. Her attempt to quietly observe the base had instead provided valuable insight into the character and professionalism of her future command. The guards who had turned her away on Friday were exactly the kind of soldiers she wanted serving under her command. Tuesday morning brought the formal change of command ceremony for Fort Harrison. The parade ground had been transformed overnight, with ceremonial flags, honor guards, and seating arrangements for hundreds of military personnel and civilian guests. The event would officially transfer command from Colonel Bradley to Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. Sarah stood in her quarters, making final adjustments to her dress uniform. The same uniform that had caused such a stir at the main gate on Monday was now adorned with ceremonial elements required for the change of command. Gold braids, ceremonial sword, and white gloves completed the formal appearance expected of a new commanding officer. The irony wasn't lost on her that less than a week ago, the same soldiers who would soon salute her as their commander had refused to let her enter the base. Friday's incident had become the talk of Fort Harrison, with the story growing more elaborate with each telling. At the security checkpoint, Sergeant Thompson was preparing for the busiest day his team had experienced in months. Visiting dignitaries, family members, and media representatives would be arriving throughout the morning, each requiring careful screening and proper escort to the ceremony. Remember, Thompson told his team, today we're going to have generals, politicians, and reporters all wanting access to the base. Standard procedures apply to everyone, regardless of rank or position. Corporal Hayes was assigned to process VIP visitors, a responsibility that had taken on new meaning since Friday's incident. She had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving and that proper verification procedures existed for good reason. Sarge, Hayes said to Thompson, after what happened on Friday, I'm going to be extra careful about checking everyone's credentials today. Thompson nodded approvingly. Good. Friday taught us that we can't make assumptions about people based on how they look or what they claim. Our job is to verify, not to guess. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was coordinating with base personnel to ensure smooth traffic flow and proper security for all ceremony attendees. The change of command would bring together people from throughout the military hierarchy, creating complex security challenges. The most important thing is maintaining our standards, Rodriguez told her team. Just because it's a special day doesn't mean we relax our procedures. If anything, we need to be more vigilant. Captain Morrison was conducting final security briefings with his entire team. Friday's incident had reinforced the importance of consistent application of security procedures, and he wanted to ensure everyone understood the lessons learned. Friday proved that our training works, Morrison told the assembled guards. We faced an unusual situation, we followed proper procedures, and we protected the base. Today, we'll apply those same standards to everyone who wants access. Meanwhile, Sarah was meeting with Colonel Bradley for their final coordination session before the ceremony. Bradley had spent the morning reviewing transition documents and ensuring that his successor had all the information needed to assume command effectively. Ma'am, I've prepared detailed briefings on all current operations, personnel issues, and ongoing projects, Bradley said. But honestly, Friday's incident taught you more about this command than any briefing could. Sarah agreed with Bradley's assessment. Colonel, that single day showed me the character of the soldiers I'll be leading. Your security team demonstrated exactly the kind of professionalism and dedication I want throughout the entire command. They're good people, Bradley confirmed. Sometimes they might seem overly cautious, but I'd rather have guards who are too careful than ones who make assumptions. As ceremony time approached, guests began arriving at Fort Harrison. Among them were Sarah's family members, Pentagon officials who had arranged her appointment, and representatives from other military installations. Each visitor underwent the same careful screening that had been applied to Sarah herself on Friday. General Patricia Stevens, the senior officer who had recommended Sarah for the Fort Harrison command, arrived in an official Pentagon vehicle. She had heard about Friday's incident and was curious to meet the security team that had turned away her protégé. I understand you've already had an interesting introduction to your new command, General Stevens said to Sarah as they prepared for the ceremony. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied. Friday's incident provided valuable insight into the quality of personnel at Fort Harrison. I've heard the guards were quite thorough in their questioning, Stevens said with amusement. I hope you're not planning any disciplinary action. On the contrary, General, I'm planning to commend them for their professionalism. They did exactly what they should have done when faced with unverified credentials. The ceremony began at precisely 1,000 hours with the traditional military precision. Honor guards presented arms, flags unfurled in the morning breeze, and hundreds of personnel stood at attention as the formal transfer of command commenced. Colonel Bradley took his position at the podium to deliver his farewell address. After 18 months of command, he was ready to pass responsibility to his successor, confident that Fort Harrison would continue its mission of excellence. Soldiers of Fort Harrison, Bradley began, it has been my privilege to serve as your commanding officer. Together, we have accomplished great things, maintained the highest standards, and proven ourselves worthy of the trust placed in us. The audience listened attentively as Bradley reviewed the unit's achievements during his tenure. Training missions completed successfully, deployment operations conducted flawlessly, and security maintained at the highest levels throughout his command. But perhaps the greatest testament to the quality of this command came just last Friday, Bradley continued, surprising many in the audience. When faced with an unusual situation, our security personnel demonstrated the professionalism, dedication, and attention to detail that defines Fort Harrison. Sergeant Thompson felt his face redden as hundreds of eyes turned toward the security section of the ceremony. He had not expected Friday's incident to be mentioned during such a formal event. These soldiers proved that they cannot be intimidated, cannot be compromised, and will not make exceptions to proper security procedures regardless of pressure or claimed authority, Bradley declared. Their actions exemplified the highest traditions of military service. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. What had begun as an embarrassing incident for the security team was being transformed into public recognition of their professionalism. Bradley concluded his remarks and formally relinquished command, symbolically passing the unit colors to General Stevens, who would transfer them to Sarah as the incoming commander. Sarah stepped forward to accept the colors, and with them, full responsibility for Fort Harrison and all its personnel. The moment was both ceremonial and practical. From this point forward, every decision affecting the base would be her responsibility. Soldiers of Fort Harrison, Sarah began her first address as commanding officer, I am honored to serve as your new commander. I come to you with high expectations, but also with complete confidence in your abilities. The formation listened as their new leader outlined her vision for the base's future. Continued excellence in training, unwavering commitment to security, and professional development for all personnel would remain the highest priorities. Some of you may have heard about the events of last Friday, Sarah continued, again focusing attention on the security personnel. I want you to understand what those events taught me about Fort Harrison. Thompson and his team stood rigidly at attention, unsure where their commander was heading with this public discussion of their encounter. Friday showed me that this base has security personnel who cannot be bluffed, intimidated, or convinced to compromise their standards, Sarah declared. When faced with claims of authority, they demanded verification. When they couldn't confirm credentials, they denied access. When pressured to make exceptions, they refused. The audience began to understand that Friday's incident was being presented as an example of proper military behavior rather than an embarrassing mistake. These soldiers demonstrated that Fort Harrison's security depends not on assumptions or appearances, but on professional verification of credentials and unwavering application of proper procedures, Sarah continued. Their actions protected this installation exactly as they were trained to do. The transformation was complete. What the security team had feared would be a source of embarrassment was instead being held up as an example of exemplary performance. I challenge every soldier at Fort Harrison to demonstrate the same level of professionalism, the same attention to detail, and the same commitment to duty that our security team showed on Friday, Sarah declared. If we maintain those standards, Fort Harrison will continue to be one of the premier installations in the United States Army. As the ceremony concluded with the traditional pass in review, Sarah reflected on the unusual beginning to her command. She had intended to observe the base quietly, but instead had received a demonstration of the character and professionalism that would define her tenure at Fort Harrison. The security team marched past the reviewing stand with obvious pride. What had begun as one of the most stressful incidents of their careers had become public recognition of their dedication and professionalism. Their new commanding officer had transformed potential embarrassment into a source of unit pride. Following the ceremony, Sarah made a point of personally greeting the security personnel who had been involved in Friday's incident. Rather than avoiding discussion of the events, she wanted to reinforce the positive lessons learned. Sergeant Thompson, Sarah said, approaching the senior guard, I want to thank you personally for your professionalism on Friday. Your refusal to compromise security standards reflects the highest military traditions. Thompson, still somewhat overwhelmed by the public praise, managed to respond appropriately. Thank you, ma'am. We just did our jobs. You did more than your jobs, Sarah replied. You demonstrated that Fort Harrison has exactly the kind of personnel needed to maintain security in an uncertain world. Similar conversations took place with Rodriguez, Hayes, Morrison, and other security personnel throughout the afternoon. Each interaction reinforced Sarah's message that Friday's incident represented success rather than failure. As the day concluded, Sarah prepared for her first evening as commanding officer of Fort Harrison. The transition had been completed successfully, the ceremony had gone off without problems, and she had begun the process of building relationships with the soldiers she would lead. Friday's incident had provided an unexpected but valuable introduction to her new command. The guards who had questioned her credentials so thoroughly were exactly the kind of soldiers she wanted protecting Fort Harrison. Their unwillingness to be intimidated or compromised would serve the base well in the months and years ahead. The woman who had been denied access on Friday was now the commanding officer of Fort Harrison, and she would never forget the lesson about professionalism and dedication that her own soldiers had taught her during that challenging encounter. 6 months had passed since Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez assumed command of Fort Harrison, and the story of her unusual introduction to the base had become legendary throughout the military community. What began as an embarrassing incident for the security team had evolved into a source of pride that defined the installation's reputation for excellence. The Pentagon had taken notice of Fort Harrison's security procedures, largely due to detailed reports about Friday's incident that had been circulated as a case study in proper protocol implementation. Other military installations were requesting briefings on Fort Harrison's training methods and security consciousness. Sarah stood in her office reviewing the latest evaluation reports from Pentagon inspectors who had visited the base the previous month. Fort Harrison had received the highest possible ratings in every category, with special commendation for security procedures and personnel training. "Ma'am," her aide announced, "there's a delegation from Fort Campbell requesting to meet with you about our security training programs." This was the fourth such request in recent weeks. Military installations across the country wanted to learn about the training methods that had produced guards capable of turning away their own commanding officer when proper procedures weren't followed. Sergeant First Class Thompson had been promoted and was now the senior security supervisor for the entire base. The same thorough attention to detail that had led him to question Sarah's credentials in civilian clothes had made him an exemplary trainer for new security personnel. "Remember," Thompson told a group of newly assigned guards, "your job is to protect this base, not to make people happy. If you can't verify credentials, you deny access. It doesn't matter who they claim to be or how important they think they are." The new guards listened intently as Thompson recounted the story of Friday's incident, which had become standard instruction for all security personnel at Fort Harrison. The lesson was clear. Proper procedures protect the base, regardless of rank, appearance, or claimed authority. Corporal Hayes, now Sergeant Hayes, was training officers from other installations on credential verification procedures. Her experience with Sarah's attempted visit had made her an expert on identifying inconsistencies and potential security threats. "The key is learning to trust your instincts while following established procedures," Hayes explained to a group of visiting security specialists. "If something feels wrong, investigate further. Don't let claims of rank or authority override your professional judgment." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been selected for promotion to Sergeant First Class and was serving as the base's senior trainer for security operations. Her calm professionalism during Friday's incident had been noticed by senior officers throughout the command structure. "Security consciousness isn't about being suspicious of everyone," Rodriguez taught her students. "It's about maintaining standards consistently, regardless of circumstances. The moment you make exceptions, you compromise the entire system." Captain Morrison had been promoted to major and was now the deputy security chief for the entire installation. His detailed documentation of Friday's incident and the professional manner in which his team had handled the situation had impressed senior commanders. "The Fort Harrison model has become the standard for security training throughout the Army," Morrison explained to a group of visiting officers. "Our people demonstrated that proper procedures work when applied consistently and professionally." The transformation of Friday's incident into a source of institutional pride had created unexpected benefits throughout Fort Harrison. Soldiers at every level took greater pride in following proper procedures, knowing that their installation was recognized for excellence in military standards. Sarah had received multiple requests to speak at military conferences about leadership and security procedures. The story of being turned away by her own guards had become a powerful example of how proper training creates soldiers who cannot be intimidated or compromised. "The real lesson of that Friday morning," Sarah told an audience of senior officers at the Pentagon, "is that security depends on soldiers who value procedure over convenience, standards over expedience, and duty over personal comfort." Her presentation included detailed analysis of how proper training had created guards capable of questioning authority when circumstances warranted investigation. The incident had demonstrated that Fort Harrison's personnel would protect the installation against any threat, regardless of its apparent source. General Stevens, who had originally recommended Sarah for the Fort Harrison command, visited the base regularly to observe the training programs that had emerged from Friday's incident. What she saw impressed her greatly. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez," Stevens said during her latest visit, "you've transformed an embarrassing situation into one of the Army's premier examples of professional security operations." Sarah appreciated the general's confidence, but she was careful to give credit where it belonged. "Ma'am, my guards deserve all the recognition. They followed their training perfectly when faced with an unusual situation." "That's exactly what makes this case study so valuable," Stevens replied. "Your people proved that proper training works even under pressure to compromise standards." The story of Friday's incident had spread beyond military circles, attracting attention from law enforcement agencies and private security companies interested in learning about training methods that produced such dedicated personnel. FBI representatives visited Fort Harrison to study the psychological aspects of the Guards' decision-making process. How had they maintained professional skepticism while remaining courteous? What training techniques had prepared them to question authority appropriately? The key is building confidence in the procedures themselves, Thompson explained to the visiting agents. When soldiers trust that following proper protocol will protect them and the installation, they're willing to apply those procedures consistently. Corporate security executives also requested briefings on Fort Harrison's training methods. The ability to create personnel who couldn't be intimidated by claims of executive authority was exactly what many companies needed for sensitive facilities. Military training translates directly to civilian security needs, Rodriguez told a group of corporate representatives. The same principles that protect military installations can protect private facilities. Sarah had established a formal training program that shared Fort Harrison's security methods with other installations while maintaining the high standards that had made the base famous. The curriculum included detailed case studies of Friday's incident and the decision-making process that had guided the Guards' actions. "We're not just teaching security procedures," Sarah explained to Pentagon officials reviewing the program. "We're teaching soldiers to think critically, question assumptions, and maintain standards under pressure." The training program had been so successful that it was being expanded to include international military personnel. Allied forces wanted to learn about creating security-conscious troops who could resist compromise attempts by hostile agents claiming legitimate authority. The Fort Harrison model demonstrates that proper training creates soldiers who cannot be bluffed, intimidated, or corrupted, explained Colonel Bradley, who had returned from retirement to help develop the international training program. Friday's incident had also influenced Sarah's approach to leadership throughout Fort Harrison. She regularly conducted unannounced visits in civilian clothes, testing various aspects of base operations to ensure standards were being maintained consistently. These surprise inspections had become legendary among the personnel, who never knew when their commanding officer might appear to observe their performance. Rather than creating anxiety, the practice had enhanced professionalism throughout the installation. "The commander's testing approach keeps everyone alert and professional," noted Master Sergeant Chen, who had been promoted to the base's senior enlisted position. "People know they need to maintain standards at all times, not just when they expect inspection." The psychological impact of Friday's incident extended far beyond security procedures. Soldiers throughout Fort Harrison understood that their commanding officer valued substance over appearance, procedure over convenience, and professional competence over blind obedience to authority. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez created a culture where doing the right thing is more important than avoiding embarrassment, observed Major Morrison during a leadership conference. That attitude influences every aspect of base operations. Sarah's leadership philosophy had been shaped significantly by her experience with the Guards who had turned her away. Their refusal to compromise standards, even when facing potential consequences, had demonstrated the kind of moral courage she wanted to see throughout her command. "Leadership isn't about getting people to do what you want," Sarah explained to a group of junior officers. "It's about creating conditions where people will do what's right, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable." The incident had also influenced Sarah's approach to personnel evaluation and promotion. Soldiers who demonstrated the ability to maintain standards under pressure were recognized and advanced, regardless of their rank or position. Thompson's promotion to senior supervisor was just one example of how Friday's incident had created advancement opportunities for personnel who proved their dedication to duty. Similar recognition had been given to Guards throughout the security section. "We promote people based on demonstrated character and professional competence," Sarah told visiting personnel officers. "Friday's incident showed us exactly what those qualities look like in practice." As Sarah prepared for her first annual evaluation as commanding officer of Fort Harrison, she reflected on the unexpected way her tenure had begun. What could have been a humiliating experience had instead provided the foundation for one of the most successful commands of her career. The Guards who had questioned her credentials so thoroughly had taught her valuable lessons about leadership, professionalism, and the importance of maintaining standards regardless of circumstances. Their unwavering commitment to duty had set the tone for everything that followed. Fort Harrison had become a model installation, recognized throughout the military for excellence in training, security, and professional development. Visiting officers regularly commented on the pride and professionalism they observed among personnel at every level. The transformation of Fort Harrison demonstrates what's possible when leaders create cultures of excellence, General Stevens noted in her evaluation of Sarah's performance. The same attention to detail that characterized Friday's incident now defines every aspect of base operations. The story of the guards who denied access to their future commanding officer had become more than just an amusing anecdote. It represented the kind of moral courage and professional dedication that the military needed to face future challenges successfully. Sarah knew that her experience at Fort Harrison would influence her approach to leadership throughout her career. The soldiers who had turned her away on Friday had taught her that true leadership meant creating conditions where people would do their duty regardless of pressure, intimidation, or personal cost. 6 months after being denied access to her own base, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez commanded one of the premier military installations in the United States. The guards who had questioned her credentials had become the foundation of her success, proving that sometimes the most challenging encounters provide the most valuable lessons about leadership and character. The woman who had been told, "Ma'am, access denied," was now the commanding officer these same soldiers saluted with pride, knowing they had helped create something extraordinary through their unwavering commitment to duty and professional excellence.